Hello everyone, Volty here, and today, boy do I have a fun one for you all. If you've been keeping up on the 7-point server, you might have seen a couple of different things about a Lurrus Death and Taxes deck that I played at Canbrawl, as well as a PoG Monthly. I figured it was finally time to talk about the deck, how it came to be, and what the challenges were when it came to putting this together. So this is the official deck tech for Lurrus, Death and Taxes. So what I started with was a personal challenge. Make a $150 deck on Moxfield, play it, and try and win an event, and then make some content. That was really all of the thought process that went into this. For those who aren't aware of the budget series, the rules that I engage with are US price, cheapest printing for all cards, and I've done it with $75 budgets and $200 budgets, so $1 a card and a reasonable amount to get into the format. And when you think about 7-point, it is an eternal format where every single card is legal, so decks tend to be quite expensive. I believe the current average price at a guess would be somewhere around the 4K mark, given the amount of dual lands that you need and every single fetch, etc. So making a $150 deck, a little bit difficult, and I really struggled with a couple of things which we'll get into, but I think the finished product was actually pretty good, and we'll talk about that as well. So the way I saw it in terms of taking on the challenge were that there were three main options. One, I could take a known deck and cut down the price. So if, for example, I was to take Grixis, make the mana base worse, make the threat base worse, see if I could get it under $150. This did not work. Option 2, I could build a cohesive deck and increase the power of each individual card with synergy, and then increase some of the individual card power levels by upgrading on price. So this would be starting with as cheap a deck as possible, and then building up. I tried this a couple of times, and for the most part, I ended up with a bunch of mono-red decks, as expected, because all of the burn spells are commons, but at the end of the day, it really does kind of fall apart during the deck building process when you're going bottom up rather than top down. Option 3, which I ultimately decided on, was to start with moderately priced cards in a relevant shell, and then fill it out with cheaper cards. So a couple of $20 cards, a couple of $10 cards, and then a bunch of commons to fill out the deck. Realistically, when building a budget deck, and this will apply to anyone who has tried to do so in the format, typically you're going to be limited to one color, or one color plus a splash off any of the cheap lands that help you make multiple colors. And realistically, I decided playing a single color was probably going to be the easiest way to do it. Part 2 is that it's really hard to spend your points when you're playing a budget deck. The vast majority of the cards on the points list are expensive mythics from newer set, or really expensive cards from back in the day. So, the average price on the points list is probably somewhere around the 600 mark, I would say, but the median price, I would imagine, is somewhere around the $80 range. And it really shows when you dig into it, how much the really expensive cards are shifting that needle. I also had to compensate for the lower average card quality by maximizing my synergy. So anyone who has built a deck that is just a good stuff deck, like Grixis or Jund, you tend to have a very high average card quality, which means the necessity for synergy is a lot lower. I was doing this in the reverse, so I really wanted to focus on synergy between my cards and making the whole a larger sum than its parts. The combination of all three of these factors ended up with me choosing a companion, and one of my favorite cards in Magic's history, Lurrus of the Dream Den. So for those of you who aren't aware, Lurrus is a 3-mana 3/2 lifelinker. during each of your turns, you may cast a permanent spell from your graveyard that costs 2 or less, and Companion, each permanent card in your starting deck has to have converted mana cost 2 or less. Basically, if you're unfamiliar with how the Companion works, it is a card that exists in your sideboard with a deck building restriction in order to be activated during the game. Prior to a rules change, you used to just be able to cast your Companion at any point where it was legal. They're all creatures, so it's basically sorcery speed. But after a rules change due to power level, you now have to spend 3 generic mana in order to put your Companion into your hand, at which point it acts as any other card. So it's essentially starting the game with an 8-card hand with extra steps in exchange for a deck building restriction. The Companions themselves range very wildly depending on both the deck restriction and the power level of the card. The 2 best Companions for 7 point are Lurrus and Lutri. Lurrus because it is an incredibly powerful card on its own, and Lutri because it has no deck building restriction for our format. So because of that, both of those cards are at 3 points, and the other 8 Companions are all at 0. But practically speaking, if we're starting at Lurrus, we have 3 of our 7 or 8 points sorted. So what Lurrus means when it comes to deck building is you have access to a card every single game. The card itself is a 6-mana creature that is a value engine, which is pretty expensive but very powerful. The deck building restriction can be minimized for our particular strategy, I guess, because most of the cards that cost 3 or more mana in mono white and mono black are really expensive monetarily. So when you're playing with a bunch of 2 and 1 drops, you get to just save a bunch of money in the budget, and I found that very helpful. The last point is something that is quite relevant here. Basically, the potency of any cards you put in your deck that have really wide matchup spreads, or really narrow hate against particular decks, that potency goes up when you get extra uses out of those cards. So if you were to think of a card like Boseiju, for example, which in a bunch of matchups is a forest, and in a bunch of matchups is a naturalized / stone rain, which is very, very powerful. Once you use your Boseiju, most of the time it's gone. Now there are cards that get to reuse Boseiju, Life from the Loam and Renin 6, for example, but beyond that, any deck that is playing Boseiju as a forest with upside is probably just going to get to use it once. In a Lurrus deck, however, any permanent-based hate that you play in your main deck, once you've used it, you have an extra shot later in the game. You also get to play those hate pieces if they're removed. So if someone lightning bolts one of your threats that would otherwise be good against them, you get a second shot at putting it into play later on. So for the game plan, what Lurrus means, you have a consistent endgame that you get to work on, but it also means that you realistically don't get any free wins during your matches because you don't have any top end that you can draw into. So if I take an example of most of the mid-range decks in the format, you have cards like Baraglyph and Pyroglyph and Deadpool, where if you draw them, some percentage of the time the game is over. All of those cards cost more than 3, and most of the cards in the format that lead to free wins cost more than 3. And Lurrus doesn't let you play any of those, so by not having any free wins, I had to really restructure how the deck was going to look, and by leaning into a slower game plan where I was attempting to grind the game out for value, that is how I chose a lot of the cards in the deck, as well as the rest of my points. So because we're playing a budget deck, pretty easy to play 8 points, and this gives us Lurrus for 3, Karakas, Stripmine, and Wasteland for 1 each, Mental Misstep, and Skull Clamp. Karakas, Stripmine, and Wasteland are all in the $10 to $15 budget range, but having your points in your mana base is usually quite powerful, just because it's a lot easier for a pointed card to be a brick in some matchups. So in any matchup where Wasteland isn't going to be on, like Mono Red, at the very least it is just a colorless land that you can leave in play, where if you were to have a pointed card that you drew, that didn't have much of an impact on the game, you're down a threat as opposed to being down a land. Mental Misstep, very powerful card, $6 to $9 range. I put it in and out a couple of different times, and realistically, if there was a better point to put into the deck, I probably would be cutting the Misstep. But due to the budget concerns, it's really hard to fill that 8th slot. And Skull Clamp, about $6. Card is completely broken in any kind of Lurrus deck that is base white and has the ability to get it. And for the most part, this deck is very, very well equipped to use the Clamp effectively. The big omissions that you'll note from this point spread, Urza Saga, which is approximately $50 to $60, which just wouldn't fit in the budget. Sol Ring, which is a nice cheap card that spends a lot of points, but if you play Sol Ring and Lurrus, you only get 2 points left, and I valued at least 3 to 4 of the 1-point cards I played more than that. And if you're playing Sol Ring and you're not playing Urza Saga, then you kind of just have a 3-point card in your deck that you have to draw. There are also a bunch of secondary color cards that you could splash for. Realistically, because of the budget restriction on the mana base, it was kind of hard to get most of these to work, but the easy ones that I could think of were 4th Eolingus, as well as playing a black build with Deathrite Charmant or Orcish Bowmasters, but for the most part, I like where I ended up. So going through a bunch of the cards that were in and out of the deck at different points in time, and what categories they would fall into, we will start with the win conditions, and this I have labeled Death as part of the Death and Taxes archetype. So we have Cloud, which gets your Clamp, gets a bunch of other equipment, and is generally just a really powerful card when you have access to a bunch of powerful equipment, especially one that you're spending a point on. Philia, card is completely broken, and as far as 2-mana white creatures go, I'm fairly confident it is the best one in the format. I don't think it's particularly close, and every single time you play this deck and you have a Philia on curve, you are usually massively far ahead. Everything has an ETB, or you can clear blockers, or you can shrink Murktide regions. Card does it all. We have Guide of Souls. This card is relatively cheap monetarily. I think it's 3 to 5, but it really critically gains you a little bit of life to stem the bleeding from just having to let things like Tarmogoyf sit and play, but also lets you jump creatures, and this is a really important way to break parity. For the most part, you have a lot of ground-based idiots in your deck, and they don't have much power, and managing to punch through and end the game is a very, very good use of the card. Weathered Wayfarer, this is in a couple of different categories, but Weathered Wayfarer is a 1-mana 1/1 that lets you tutor your library for any land, as long as your opponent has more lands than you. Weathered Wayfarer acts as a toolbox in this deck. We already have 3 points spent on our mana base in Caracas, Strip Mine, and Wasteland, and there are a bunch of other utility lands that you can get at the cost of a 1-mana 1/1. So, very low cost, incredibly powerful card. Legacy Death and Taxes has cut it, but realistically, I think it's always worth a slot. We have Luminarch, Aspirant, Warden of the Inner Sky, and Smuggler's Copter. All of these offer a little bit of utility, but realistically, they are just threats that get really big and end the game. You don't have to play these if you want to play a full-on control Death and Taxes build, but if you're playing against any kind of combo matchup and you just need to race them, these cards are really good at just killing people. The Hate Bears, which is Taxes Part 1, all of these cards have some kind of impact on the game. However, the potency of that impact ranges quite wide. There are a bunch of Hate Bears on this list that will just be stats when you play them, because they don't matter in the particular matchup that you're in. However, when you're playing a budget deck, when you're playing a Lurrus deck, and you're trying to grind games out, most of the time you will draw some amount of Hate Bears that do matter, and the ones that don't, you can still just use as warm bodies, and it's not too bad. Critically, in this deck, all of these Hate Bears are permanents, so you can stick them. If they die, you can Lurrus them back. If they don't die, you can use them to control the game or slow it down. And most of these are also quite versatile, so Lion Sash hitting graveyards, but also letting you get a big guy. Dryad Militant hoses things like Grixis and Delve threats, but also works against Yorgwill piles. Cathar Commando is a disenchant, but it's also a really big guy with flash. Thalia is completely great in this deck. You don't have that many non-creature spells, and most other decks do. Leonin Arbiter taxes your opponent's fetch lands, as well as all of their actual tutors, like Vamp and Mystical and Worldly. Containment Priest is great, and has a bunch of synergies in the deck, like with Philia, where you can use it as a removal spell, but also gives you game against things like Green Sun Zenith, Natural Order, etc., on top of the anti-graveyard reanimate strategies. White Orchid Phantom, if you get to flicker it a bunch of times, you can slowly run your opponent out of mana, but realistically it's just in the deck as a flyer with First Strike, as a warm body, that also gets to blow up things like Academy and Workshop in some matchups. Phyrexian Revoker is a 2-mana 2/1 that turns off an activated ability. It's very similar to Pithing Needle, and is one of the few cards in the format in our restriction that can deal with Planeswalkers. Spiral Labyrinth stops people from drawing extra cards. An Invasion of Gobekhan is a Thoughtseize variant that also gives Hexproof and Indestructible to your guys, while also making them bigger. Every single time I played Invasion of Gobekhan across the 2 events I played this deck, my opponent had to read it, they tried to understand it, they missed some part of it, and it won the game. The card just wins a lot of games by itself. The support cast, so we have 2 Mums, 2 Bodyguards, Aether Vial to give uncounterability and to speed us up, Samwise, which lets us buy back key threats, and the 2 Inspectors to give us a bit of card velocity, as well as just extra guys in play. They combo really, really well with things like Guide of Souls, giving you a thing that you can play that isn't just a brick, but also works with Warden of the Inner Sky, and then the clues give you extra gas in the late game, as well as a way to spend your mana if you hold it up to hold up a removal spell and they don't do anything. The mana denial part of the strategy, so we have Strip and Waste, which we're spending points on. There is also a Rishadan Port and a Ghost Quarter, and a Weathered Wayfarer to get all 4 of those. There is also a Samwise, which can pick up Strip Mine, Wasteland, and Ghost Quarter if you save them for the turn that you're putting Samwise in play, giving you an extra shot at that effect. And if you have Caracas, you can pick up the Samwise and put together a very slow strip lock, which I did on camera in my coverage match in Canbrawl. Lastly, we have White Orchid Phantom, as mentioned previously. For the most part, using it as mana denial is not its intended purpose. It's mainly there to blow up really specific lands that do a lot. But if you have 2 mana and you're going to run it out, there's a decent chance that your opponent is running low on basics and you might cut them on a color. And the rest of the deck is just a bunch of efficient and relatively flexible removal spells, a bunch of utility lands for your Weathered Wayfarer, as well as just to spend your mana base in a meaningful way, and utility creatures. There's a couple that have quite a lot of different kinds of text in different matchups, but for the most part, this part of the deck you can adjust however you want. The sideboard is a bunch of hate cards and a Lurrus. How you build your sideboard is up to you. I would strongly recommend 14 cards that hate on various archetypes and a Lurrus. So this is the first deck list that I played at the PoG Monthly for August. The deck list will be in the description below for all of the decks that you can see on screen. But as you can see, it is a relatively simple deck. There's a bunch of 1s, there's a bunch of 2s, there's a bunch of spells, there's a bunch of artifacts with varying degrees of relevance, 12 planes and 9 other utility lands, and then a sideboard that is filled to the brim with hate. Pretty simple stuff, and there is coverage from that event. I played it on camera twice, but for the most part, this list came in at about 148 at time of submission. I think it's gone up by a couple of dollars since then. Can't do much about that. For the PoG run, there were 36 players, and I won against lands, drew against Moon, won against Goblins, lost to Walks, won against Shops, and then drew versus Jund. I think both of my draws were avoidable. and I noticed that because I had lent more on the taxes elements of the deck, I didn't have a critical mass of ways to just end the game, and the fact that I picked up 2 draws in this event is a big part of how the Luminarch Aspirant made it back in. But for the most part, if people understand what cards do and don't have to read everything that you play, especially if you power up the deck and play a bunch of cards that aren't random commons, you should be able to finish your matches in time. This is the deck list that I played at Canbrawl5. It is relatively similar, but there are a bunch of changes that stand out if you're paying attention. The snow-covered plains changed to regular plains, and that's because we cut on thin ice. I also adjusted the budget and put a JIT into the deck as an extra equipment, which was very much a bonus when it came to a bunch of matchups. The Luminarch Aspirant and the Warden of the Inner Sky made it into the deck as ways to close it out, and the sideboard hate pieces were adjusted slightly, but in concept, the deck is pretty much the same. At Canbrawl, I had a much better event. There were 107 players, so 7 rounds of Swiss. I won against Breach Bond, Green Eldrazi, Mono Red, Jund, and then Red Green lands. I then double ID'd into top 8. I then won against Blue Red Moon, and then lost to Judas on Grixis. The loss against Grixis was very, very close, and I think both of the games could have swung either way if I didn't flood out or if my opponent did flood out. But for the most part, it is a very hard matchup, and it's one of the hardest ones in the format, but still very proud of this result. So, talking about the concept of Death and Taxes and moving forward, I've played a lot of Legacy Death and Taxes. The deck is very, very fond to me, and I really, really like a lot of the play patterns. It always feels like you're hanging out on the knife's edge, and if you make a mistake, you just lose the game on the spot. But if you play perfectly the entire way and get a little bit lucky, you kind of just win with 2x beatdown, which is something that I really like. Additionally, there are a bunch of free win matchups in Death and Taxes for Legacy specifically, just because you're playing 4 Wastelands and 4 Rishadan Ports, and you can kind of get away against a bunch of matchups by getting hard carried by some of your pieces. The tutors that hold the Legacy deck together were not available to me. For the most part, this is Stoneforge Mystic, which is more expensive than Cloud, and I couldn't afford to play both, and Recruiter of the Guard and Ranger Captain of Eos, which you can't play with Lurrus. Additionally, a bunch of threats just aren't allowed when you're playing Lurrus, so Archon of Emeria, Solitude, Skyclave Apparition, Palace Jailer, Witch Enchanter. There's a whole list, and if you do a scryful of white creatures that start at CMC 3, you're going to see quite a lot of bangers. However, while exploring the deck, I do think that Lurrus Death and Taxes is pretty possible to build in a way that is actively very good. There are a couple of different ways that you could upgrade the deck in order to make it more viable, and as long as you're paying attention to the metagame and you keep your sideboard fresh with the right hate pieces, you should be able to do very well at any event, provided that you keep an eye on things and make sure your deck list is correct. There is a caveat to this if you're looking to pick the deck up, and the deck is really, really difficult to play. If you mess up anything at any point in time, you're probably going to lose the game. This is whether you're playing a budget version or an upgraded version, although if your deck is more powerful, pound for pound, you can kind of get bailed out of some spots. But when you're playing a bunch of 1-mana 1/2s and you play the wrong one and it punishes you because you find yourself having a chump block and you haven't had time to deploy the other one, you might find yourself in a hole that, was an error from turn 2 that showed up on turn 6 and lost you the game. So, if you're wanting to try this deck out, my Canbrawl list was really good, in my opinion. It was $149.90 at time of submission. That equates to $300-ish, especially now that some changes have happened and, probably not being able to find the absolute dirt cheap version of every single card. But it's still a very easy way to get into the format, and you can, buy a bunch of commons to move things around. You probably already have some of the cards from other formats. A bunch of the cards in the deck are Commander staples, for example. It's really cheap. It was pretty good. It's really fun. If you're already playing a lot of 7-point and you have a collection, you're probably not going to be operating on a budget. I had the ability to play an expensive deck, but I wanted to test myself and really try this. If you want to skip the step where you play the really budget version deck and try and get lucky, there are a bunch of different ways you can upgrade the concept and play Lurrus Death and Taxes, or Death and Taxes in general, and I'll provide each of these now. So first up is true Death and Taxes. As you can see, the curve goes a lot higher. We have a bunch of 3-drops, we have some 4-drops, we have a Solitude, we don't have Lurrus anymore. You additionally get to play things like Chrome Mox and Sol Ring and Stoneforge Mystic as ways to expand the price of the deck while also making it a little bit more powerful or more consistent. A lot of the 3-drops are really, really good. Archon, as mentioned before, Pre-War Formalware being an equipment is something that Lurrus decks don't have access to. Skyclave, Recruiter of the Guard, Palace Jailer, Witch Enchanter, and Solitude, which are all 4+, are all incredibly good cards. And if you want to play a true Death and Taxes style because you've played it in Legacy, this is probably where I would start. We then have Lurrus Humans, so there are still some tax elements in this deck, but it's really leaning into the human synergy. For the most part, Lurrus lets you buy back threats, and it gives you a bit of longevity, which does mean that if you build your deck in a way that is more aggressive, you can kind of get backed up by Lurrus behind it. Champion of the Parish, Coppercoat Vanguard, Thalia's Lieutenant are the main human payoffs. But there are, a bunch of humans that have some amount of text or some amount of hate. And then you also get Metallic Mimic as an extra human payoff. And then you just kind of change some of the slots. So the Selfless Savior turned into a Dauntless Bodyguard because that's a human. The Judge's Familiar turned into an Esper Sentinel because that's a human. And you get a Mutavault in your mana base and a Cavern of Souls in your mana base, both of which are very, very powerful. So a couple of adjustments, and you could find the midway point between Lurrus Death and Taxes and Lurrus Humans, but I wanted to lean into the Humans deck and build that list, just to make it very visible what was possible if you went down that road. And lastly, we have Lurrus Legends. So this is kind of like the Boros Legends deck that exists, however, with 2 restrictions. 1, it's mono-white, and 2, it's Lurrus. So you don't get any of the 3-drop legends that are really, really powerful. You don't get any of the red legends that are really powerful, like Ragavan. But the deck is still very functional. There are enough 1-drops to turn on Mox Amber. There are enough 0-mana artifacts to turn on Mox Opal and Chrome Mox. You have an Urza Saga, so your constructs can get really, really big. A lot of the hate pieces and value 2-drops are already legendary, so you get paid off there. Yoshimaru, insanely large card, and then the biggest payoff, obviously, which is Flowering of the White Tree. There are a couple of other legendary payoffs on top of Mox Amber, Flowering, and Yoshimaru. Mostly it's the Abstergo Entertainment, which you get access to, Minas Tirith, and Plaza of Heroes. Beyond this, it is kind of just a beatdown deck. There is enough hate to slow down certain archetypes and try and get an edge here and there, but you are trying to abuse a lot of the fast mana that is available to you when you lean into the Legends package, because Mox Amber lets you also play Mox Opal, and then you just start getting to dump your hand as quickly as possible. In summary, I love Death and Taxes. I love the Legacy deck very, very much, and I do think that most of the principles that apply to Death and Taxes and how it's been built over the course of Legacy's history can be ported over to 7-point. The deck isn't really flashy, and it's definitely not very potent. There are not going to be any free games. There's not going to be any easy mode matches. However, it's really, really fun, and it tests you in a lot of ways. You have to understand the overall metagame a lot better. You have to understand what cards your opponent has available on key turns so that you can work out whether you need to Rishton port them or what hate bear to play. And realistically, I think if you sat down and played a lot of Death and Taxes, you would just get better at Magic, because it will test you in ways that aren't really available if you're playing other strategies. All of the deck lists will be in the description below, as well as some links to coverage matches that I have played with the archetype. But otherwise, that's going to be it for Death and Taxes, and if you have any questions, feel free to reach out on my server or the 7-Point server. I want to thank everyone who has been supporting me for the last couple of months on Patreon. It really means a lot to me that people are willing to help out in the creation of content. Without their help, I just wouldn't be able to feed myself, and I probably wouldn't be able to do this full time. So big shout outs to everyone who has been supporting me. If you want to look into that, I will drop a link below to my Patreon page. There's a little bit of exclusive content, and I will be increasing the amount of exclusive content over time. But at the very least, if you want to support the channel and you want to support my content, that is an avenue for you. But otherwise, that's going to be it from me, and I will see you all next time.